Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. $1 trillion was wiped off software stocks after Anthropic released an AI legal tool. The market is asking, if AI agents can do the work, why pay for the software? The SaaSpocalypse has dragged everything down from Microsoft to Salesforce, leaving Wall Street split on whether this is an existential risk or a massive overreaction.
I want to know what's really vulnerable, what's overblown, and where the money is flowing instead. And in today's dumb question of the week, what is a moat? All right, let's get into it. So there's been some massive moves in markets over the last week or so, Romin. But if you were an index investor and ignored the news, didn't look at the Financial Times or Bloomberg, just looked at your index fund, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything was happening.
Yeah, it's one of these really extreme situations where there's a huge amount of turmoil under the surface, and it's only if you can see those currents that you realize something big's going on. It's what we call a rotation from one sector to another.
And very crudely, the rotation was away from software and professional services and data firms, things like that, and into things like consumer staples, into the boring stuff.
Yeah, boring finally made it. So everyone's talked about the value rotation. Well, this has happened quite violently, I have to say, over the course of the last couple of weeks.
And I saw some graphs showing that the rotation into things like consumer staples was like a 4 sigma event, whatever that means, Romin.
Well, essentially that's saying that it should never happen, or at least it's a very, very rare occurrence. So if you think about volatility, that's the typical percentage price move in an index or in a single stock. Now, 1 sigma moves happen all the time. 2 sigma moves are quite unusual. 3 sigma is rare. 4 sigma is unheard of or very, very, very unusual.
Well, we haven't seen this kind of rotation in a long time, so that does make sense. But the numbers are staggering. So if we go back to software and what's sold off, if you look at the subsection of the S&P 500 that focuses on software and services, S&P has an index that tracks this, that fell more than 13%, and it fell in 6 straight sessions, and is down more than 25% from its peak in October 2025. That's a big fall for a lot of these stocks which have been the winners over the last decade.
Now, it hasn't been completely indiscriminate, but if I do look at the sector breakdown of the S&P 500, for example, and just look for red and green over the last week, you're right, it's the mega caps which are largely affected. Not all of them, but certainly some of the huge hitters. And all the boring sectors like healthcare, industrials, financials, consumer staples, even utilities are looking okay. It's the sexy stuff, information technology, communication services, consumer discretionary, which has really been hit.
And so what's going on here? Is this the market waking up to the fact that AI is coming? Well, it's here. AI is here. And up until recently, the market had been focused on where are the big winners, things like Nvidia. Is it now realizing that disruption's coming and there are going to be some big losers as well?
I think that's true. And I think also there are questions about capital expenditure. And in a way, you could think of this as a Capex crash, because certainly part of the story has been that some of the mega caps have been spending hugely on things like hyperscaling, building out the infrastructure, the data centers, even the energy behind those data centers. And investors quite rightly are saying, well, how much have you paid for this? What's the return on this investment going to be? Particularly if you're just one of the many service providers that are rolling out AI. And we're getting to the point now where almost everything has got AI in it. And you're always thinking, why am I paying 10 different subscriptions for essentially what is the same thing? So inevitably, after the efflorescence of a given technology, a given narrative, you get the consolidation. And I think we're pretty clearly reaching that point.
So I think maybe it's worth digging into that, because I think there's 2 stories going on there in what you just said. You've got the massive hyperscalers like Google, like Microsoft, who are spending insane amounts of money building out these data centers to power their AI models. And you're right that the market is nervous about that, saying, collective, you're going to spend, I think it's $600 billion this year on Capex. unheard of. Like, that's sort of government style spending. But then on the other side, you've got the pure software providers, things like Salesforce, like Palantir, like SAP, where their business model is very different. They're interacting directly with other businesses and are selling software often on per seat licensing deals. And it's sticky income. They're capital light businesses generally. But the market's now looking at them and saying, if AI can replace a lot of what they do, we shouldn't be paying so much for those stocks because they have been trading on very stretched multiples.
Yeah, I guess if your business model is founded on the idea that, okay, we've created this neat little piece of software for some particular niche thing. For example, a good example, I think, actually is Figma, where its stock has fallen by around 40%. Now, if you've ever used Figma, it's actually a really nice app, but it lets you essentially create a visual version of a website, which is highly functional, but which allows people to just wireframe what a website looks like or an app looks like before it's actually built. So it's a kind of language for speaking to developers. But you have to think now, if I can just talk to Claude and say, look, this is what I want, and it goes off and creates the app, which is now very much a thing, you can do that, then what's Figma's USP? What is it that sets it apart, other than the fact that it's got momentum, that it's got existing paying customers? So you can see why, if Figma was trading at a high multiple, well, suddenly those future earnings don't look at all guaranteed. In fact, they look quite ropey.
We've seen this happen to industries in the past, haven't we? For example, the print media, newspapers and magazines and all of that, was once a very profitable business, believe it or not. But the internet changed all that, didn't it? And in the initial stages, you might have thought, wow, this is actually quite good for these industries because their distribution cost is going to zero. When we used to have to print newspapers and drive them around the country on trucks and put them in shops, that's expensive. We don't need to do that anymore. People can just read it online. But that's true for every newspaper. So while it was good for their margins in theory, it was really bad for them as a business because the barrier to entry was eliminated. And over time, new entrants, so digital-first content creators, and then user-generated content got all the eyeballs, right? So you don't want to be in print media anymore. People fear that's what could happen to software. If people can spin up their own software, they're not going to pay a premium to software companies. Though I think that's overstated. Businesses outsource their software needs generally because it's not their core competency. They don't want to be writing code for, I don't know, customer service systems and accounting systems. We're here to sell widgets. Basically, they want to buy a software product and not think about it, just trust it works. So I'd be surprised if every company starts building their own systems.
Yeah, I agree. And I think some companies do want to have their own systems, particularly if security is a big deal, which it is for many different industries. I worked in finance, obviously, and I worked on the IT side for a while. And if you've ever worked in an IT system, you realize that the development is almost irrelevant. You know, that's an initial upfront cost. Everyone gets excited. They write a spec and you write the code. 95% of what goes into a piece of software is the maintenance, the bugs, the data changes, and then that causes a problem. The users require new things, and you've got to use gaff tape and a little bit of magic to make sure that the new monstrosity somehow stays in one working state. And that's not an easy thing to do. It requires expertise. It requires developers and developers who've got experience of developing this stuff.
And there's a high switching cost, isn't there? You're always worried something's going to break, which is why a load of bank systems still run on COBOL from like the 70s, right?
Oh, yeah. I was speaking to someone recently, one of my clients in a power hour, and they said, yeah, they still have COBOL developers. They still exist. So I think that's the misunderstanding, which is that software isn't just about code. It's also about actually having to maintain something and having people in-house who the buck stops with. If you've got a hallucinating AI system, which sometimes gets it right, often gets it right, but doesn't always, that's a lot less powerful, I think, than the developer using those AI tools and their own experience to ensure they have a working system. I still think it's the case that for mission critical systems, of which there are many, then you're not going to trust AI to do it, at least not now. Maybe in the future that'll be possible, but certainly at this stage, I think that is a pipe dream.
Okay, counter argument. I think that's true. Random companies aren't going to start spinning up their own software for things that aren't their core purpose. But if the cost of writing new code goes way down and the speed that you can write new code goes way up, which seems to be happening, if you look at graphs of the number of websites being published and the amount of code being committed to things like GitHub, it's going exponential right now. So something's happening with productivity. If that continues and it gets really cheap and really fast to make new software, then the existing software companies, the ones that are selling off, it will be quite easy for them to try and go after their competitors' lunch, move into other verticals. And so you might see this rapid cannibalization and margins falling because the software space becomes really competitive.
I think that's true. There's a really nice quote from Nick Train, who runs one of the most successful UK actively managed funds. Now, obviously, successful is a relative term here, but his portfolio has been absolutely crushed during this sell-off because he tilted very much towards digital winners over recent years, which worked out originally, but not so much over the last month or so. So here he is, for example, talking about Sage, the accounting software. He said, Sage is not offering summaries or basic reports. It operates within the accounting industry, where trust, reliability, and accuracy when dealing with complex workflows are critical. Enterprises simply won't trust an application that hallucinates and offers different answers each time. Now, you could say that he's just putting his head in the sand and that that's not true. If someone's going to offer a cheaper product, people will just pile into that.
You could say he's just talking his book, Romin.
But I think he's got a point. I think he's right that eventually people are going to gravitate towards the most trusted brands, and brands are going to become ever more important when it comes to having these really trusted systems. For things which aren't so mission critical or which aren't so heavily regulated, I think there'll be less of a barrier to entry.
I feel like we're in a time where no one really knows what's going to happen. The sort of potential futures are really dispersed, and who knows which of them is going to play out. And I found a really great quote from Warren Buffett. You might think, why are you quoting Warren Buffett on technology, right? He stays away from this stuff. But listen to this. He says, I've always said the easier thing to do in these transforming events is to figure out the losers. You could have grasped in 1905 or so the importance of the automobile when it came along, but still found it hard to pick companies that would make you money. But there was one obvious decision you could have made back then, and that was to short horses. Frankly, I'm disappointed that the Buffett family was not short horses through this entire period. And we really had no excuse. Living in Nebraska, we would have found it super easy to borrow horses and avoid a short squeeze. So it's a great quote.
That's very good.
And I think he's got a point, hasn't he? You saw the same in the dot-com bubble. How did you know Amazon was going to be the big winner? The random bookstore and not the random pet store or the random shoe store, which then would expand to do all these other business lines. Almost impossible to predict. But maybe you could have had a better guess at what the losers were going to be. Print media, department stores, travel agents, all that kind of stuff was going to go away.
I think the difficulty at the moment is that every single company is going to come out as part of its defense and say, well, actually, we're already an AI company. We've already got AI built into our offering. So, in fact, this is a boost for us rather than a drag. Whereas I think a horse and buggy company couldn't have turned around and said, look, we're not affected by this horse thing. We're going to fit motors into our buggies. Whereas with software, I think it's a lot easier to plumb in some kind of AI, particularly now that we've got China's open source AI models, where it's not that difficult, I don't think, if you do have developers in-house, to add AI to your offering.
But that's stretching credibility, I think. That all software companies are going to successfully transform themselves to use AI and defend their position in the market. So, for example, Duolingo, which is the language learning app, a good app. I've used it and failed to learn German from it. But its stock price peaked at around $530 in May last year and is now trading at less than $120. A big fall in less than a year. And you can see that play out across loads of different software companies. Look at the graphs, pull them up, pull up the stock charts and see that precipitous fall over the last year, which has accelerated. January was the worst month since 2008 for US software stocks.
Oh, yeah, I think the companies which don't adapt clearly may well die. But I think you've got to understand that for software, it isn't a matter of completely re-rigging your manufacturing line. It is a matter of simply developing and using the existing technology. So I think the problem will be that some companies don't do that. They will go down the route of Kodak and just say, look, this is a fad. We're not going to pay attention to it. We're not going to adapt to it.
But even if they try to adapt, they're not going to be able to build foundational AI models. They don't have the infrastructure to do that. It's really expensive to build a data center. They're going to be buying that service in from OpenAI or Google or Anthropic, whoever. The question is, if all software companies are doing that, who's going to capture that value from selling software? Is it going to be the incumbent who owns the relationship with the client and has the data and the reputation for now? Or is it going to be Anthropic? Because they have the special sauce. They're the ones that own the model.
Well, I'd question whether they do have this special sauce. I think a lot of this technology could well become commoditized. For example, if you look at what is coming out of China, it is all open models. That means that you can download the neural network, the weights of the network, and run it on your own PC if you had the resources. Now, that's not cutting edge. It's probably lagging by about 3, 4, 5 years.
Not that much, by about 6 months, I think.
Okay. But the fact is that you can use those models. So what I expect is going to happen is that if Anthropic sets the price too high, all that companies are going to do is move over to these cheaper open source models. So I think that's going to keep a lid on how much Anthropic can charge. And, I was playing around with Anthropic over the weekend, and I was doing something with running this kind of background process that we use for our trackers for PensionCraft. And it was great. It kind of showed me how to automate the process, how to change the code. But then suddenly it said, you've run out of money, put more money in the meter. So at 7 o'clock last night on a Sunday, I suddenly had to stop developing and switch to another AI.
Or you could have just put more money in the meter. You cheapskate.
Yeah, I could have. But I just felt kind of upset about it because there's other AI software that I pay for. So I thought, fine, I'll just go for that. And eventually I got it working. So it was all good. But I think that's the danger, which is that one AI company, okay, it's going to innovate, it's going to push ahead of the pack. And then people assume that that's going to be the winner. Whereas I think there's so much competition for this technology, and a lot of it is free. So it's going to be difficult to keep that edge.
It's really interesting. I think it's a great point. That at the moment, we've got software companies selling off at the same time as there's a wobble in the value and people are getting nervous about all this Capex spending by the model makers, which are the ones that are meant to be going in and eating the lunch of the software companies. They're both kind of falling a bit together. It makes me wonder if the whole thing could be commoditized, like intelligence broadly is commoditized. This is a sort of nightmare scenario, I guess, if you're a capitalist investor, that effectively it's so deflationary. It's terrible for wages. It's terrible for software companies' earnings. It's terrible for AI model builders' earnings. Like everything goes down.
I don't think that's true. And I think there are certain companies which do have discriminators which allow us to say, actually, these will probably do okay.
All right, let's come on to that in the second half. How do we tell the losers from the winners in a period of unprecedented disruption?
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 stocks and shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and one of the lowest FX fees I could find on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers with Invest accounts can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which has no FX fees, true interbank rates, and offers 1.5% cashback on all transactions up to £15 per month. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code RAMIN, RAMIN, within 10 days of signing up, or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service, not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You are responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional. 212 cards are issued by Paynetics, which provide all payment services. Trading 212 provides customer support and user interface. Terms and fees apply.
Okay, so as we stand at the moment, when you look at software companies, it seems to be the market's thinking about what's going to happen in the next 12, 24 months and longer, rather than what's actually happening now. So earnings are fine. Pretty much all software companies in the S&P 500 beat earnings expectations this quarter. So this is really an instance of multiple compression. It's not an earnings collapse.
Which was a long time coming. I thought it was exuberance, and it was. People were overpaying for future profits, and that's never going to end well. But what's happening is actually, despite this quite recent sharp sell-off, it's been fairly benign. This doesn't look like the kind of sell-off where it's going to last a decade. It's more likely to be something where there is a discrimination between certain stocks and others. Some get hammered, some recover, some don't. And like you say, the index as a whole hasn't fallen.
So I imagine there's going to be a spectrum where some companies are super vulnerable to disruption from AI and other companies are more resilient. What is it that's going to put companies at risk or potentially make them benefit from this new technology?
Oh, I think the list is long. It's weird because all the stuff that was sexy suddenly is no longer quite so sexy. And all the boring stuff suddenly becomes more interesting because it's still the case that we have a physical life. We have a physical existence. Software and IT was really the thing that captured our attention over the last decade. Whereas in the next decade, perhaps it'll be more about stuff. Now, there are geopolitical reasons behind that. If you have a war, then your software might be great, but if you're being bombed, well, that's cold comfort. So I think weapons and arms are obviously something which probably I think will do well out of this. And any kind of physical manufacturing process, until we get embodied AI, that is, I think that's likely to do well as well.
Yeah, and that would be quite a change because for the last 40, 50 years, asset-light businesses have been the ones that have outperformed and done really well. And we've got used to that. We're humans that are programmed with recency bias in our heads. And it's a massive change to think, well, hang on, maybe it's commodity stocks and energy stocks that are going to do really well. And the asset-light stuff might not have the moats we thought they had.
And the word capital intensive used to be a dirty word when it came to investing. The idea that you could just rustle up a software company out of a few ideas and end up with $1 billion valuation in a matter of a few years, that could only happen in something which doesn't require huge Capex. But in fact, those companies are the ones which probably will come through this pretty well. They may even end up benefiting from the fact that you can use AI to streamline their manufacturing processes.
Okay, so on a very high level, you think we're going more towards investing in atoms rather than bits. But I want to focus on the bits. That's this episode. We're talking about software and services. Within that category, what's going to discriminate between the ones that do well and the ones that are really at existential risk right now?
I think the two primary things that I can think of at least, would be things like data. And here I'm thinking about mostly customer data, how they behave, what they buy, demographics around that customer base. And certain companies have so many touch points with their customers that they've got an incredibly valuable database. Or it may be something niche like stock prices, or perhaps it's going to be weather data or legal precedents, that kind of thing. A very curated, specialist, niche database. which is also proprietary. And then on the other side, I think the other big discriminator is going to be highly regulated industries. So things like finance, things like pharmaceuticals, where essentially there's a huge amount of legal restrictions on who can provide the service. And also lots of domain expertise. You can't just waltz into the pharmaceutical industry and say, look, my AI tells me this is going to be a brilliant drug to cure cancer without any kind of testing and also safety checks on the drug in the actual physical systems, in biological systems. Another one might be legal services where, okay, if you want to look over a contract for your insurance, you trust an AI to just get that roughly right and to spot any glaring errors. But if you're negotiating a multi-million pound contract with a large company, you're not going to get AI to negotiate that or look through the contract or draft the contract, or at least not without any kind of human intervention. The stakes are just too high.
That all sounds right, doesn't it? But I wonder if, when it comes to things like legal firms, who tend to charge on a billable hours basis, that might be under threat because people know that these workers you've got are going to be way more productive. And there was a story in the FT, which I thought maybe illuminated this. It wasn't about legal services. It was about auditing. And you might think, again, auditing, heavily regulated. You can't just come in and plug yourself into Claude and say, don't need to look at my books. Claude says it's fine, right? You can't do that. But here's the story in the FT. KPMG pressed its auditor to pass on AI cost savings. Now, the reason I thought this was really interesting is because KPMG is itself one of the biggest auditors in the world. And it knows what's up. It knows what's going on right now. And it basically said to its auditor, Grant Thornton, we know you're saving loads of money with AI right now. That's not going to go into your margins. We want you to reduce the cost you charge us for the audit. To me, this is a canary in the coal mine because this is like two auditors speaking to each other who know the business. And if that plays out across the whole industry, like across professional services more broadly, what they hoped might be margin expansion from AI becomes commodification and perhaps not the earnings boost everyone was hoping for.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And if it is services that we're talking about, usually the biggest cost in services is going to be the staff. And I remember when I got divorced, I was just looking at how much it cost me just to speak to the guy who was my lawyer. And literally, he'd recorded every single phone call in terms of minutes and seconds. And that's what he was charging me for. And I was joking with my now ex-wife, every time we talk to them, it's costing us a fortune. So let's just talk to them less. And, between us, we decided maybe that forced us into an amicable divorce. I don't know.
And isn't it weird how similar that is to what we're moving to, where every time you burn a token, it's like billable hours, it's going to cost you. If you just say thanks to the AI model, you've just spent some money. It's like emailing a lawyer to say thanks. Never do it.
But the question is, how far is it going to go? If it was the case that you have to negotiate a huge contract with another company, will AI push down the cost of that? Maybe for the basic stuff. But then you've got to think, is this going to create a spate of new entrants into that market, which are going to try and undercut those big companies? Or will it be a matter of people trusting established law firms? And will they just end up outsourcing those low quality pieces of work to companies which are AI-based?
I suspect we will see that. We'll see in-house legal teams armed with AI and fewer staff, but able to handle all the sort of low-hanging fruit that typically they might outsource to a bespoke law firm. But then when there's a really high-profile, important deal being made, or something's going to end up in court, you're not going to send the robot to argue in front of the judge. You're still going to pay a top law firm. So I'm going to guess, we're going to see the mid-market hollowed out and a bifurcation of the business. I could see that happening in consulting too. At the moment, I reckon consulting firms are kind of benefiting from the AI implementation, but I reckon that windfall is probably just a transition effect. But I don't think all software companies are going to necessarily suffer. We've seen a pretty indiscriminate sell-off within the software basket right now, but maybe that presents opportunities. So I've seen a lot of people saying that the cybersecurity firms have sold off alongside everything else, things like CrowdStrike. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe they are the ones that will benefit from mass adoption of AI Because artificial intelligence will open up a whole new sort of plane of attack for hackers, right? Maybe you're going to need more cybersecurity, not less. And maybe it's not so easy for that to be disrupted. Maybe the sell-off's overdone.
Yeah, there I think it'll be difficult to find winners. And I think there it may be easier to create a company which can do cybersecurity if you have access to the AI models yourself. And that's because the best security companies have the best hackers. These are the people who actually maybe in the past have actually been people on the other side of the law who are poachers turned gamekeepers. So presumably, you could also use AI to work out what the angles of attack were by creating your own attacks on dummy systems. I'm just thinking, what would the barrier to entry be here?
That's always the right question to ask, I think. How defensible is their competitive advantage? I don't know enough about cybersecurity to say. It seems like there's a few firms that dominate. Whether they can be disrupted, we'll see. Would you agree with me, though, that the most vulnerable firms are any that get directly in the way of the AI model makers? So in the very first instance, any company that's automating simple, repeatable tasks, data entry, dashboards, document review, copywriting, all that stuff, to me, those companies are dead. They just don't know it yet.
Yeah, one of the ones we use quite a lot to do the plumbing in the background is Zapier. And that essentially lets one system talk to another. And it's got loads of plugins, thousands. And if you think about it, if you've got 1,000 inputs, 1,000 outputs, you've got millions of combinations. And it's incredibly powerful, but presumably they could also develop AI to do the plugging in from one to another. In fact, they already do. So I think as long as these companies are quick on their feet, I don't think they're going to be necessarily dead in the water. But would I pay huge amounts for that stock? Probably not.
Yeah. I think any company that's competing directly with the foundational models is going to be in trouble because internally at Anthropic and OpenAI and wherever, they have unlimited access to tokens. They have the best models because they don't publish them immediately. So they're coding with stuff that's better than what any other software company has, probably. They're also getting tokens at cost. When I say tokens, I mean just the ability to use the model. They're getting that at cost, whereas other companies are having to pay a margin on top of that. So I think if you're going up against them in an arms race, you're probably going to lose, aren't you?
No, again, I think if you have got these open source models, I don't think that's necessarily true. If it was the case that they had some kind of completely proprietary system where you couldn't go for anything open source that would do the same task, maybe not as well, then yes, they'd have an absolute edge. But I don't think that's the case. And that's the real problem, I think, with assuming that they're going to just sweep the board.
Yeah, maybe. I guess that just comes down to a question of how much further progress do you think is going to be made in AI? And is it just an inevitability that all model makers will progress at a similar kind of rate? Or can there be a winner who has a competitive advantage within making AI models?
Well, they're kind of banking on that at the moment. They're assuming that, yeah, you're going to pay for the better model, which is true until it becomes a mature technology.
If it becomes mature, this is the debate within AI, right? Are we on a kind of fast takeoff route where there is no mature, we end up with the singularity, it sweeps the board, capitalism's over, none of this really matters?
I think in a sense, we've already seen a plateauing. We've seen incredible expectations, but then the reality of using AI day to day makes you realize that it's not quite what it's blown up to be.
Oh, this is where we disagree. Over the last 2 or 3 months, using it every day, co-work, and even I've touched Claude Code now, and I'm not a coder. And yeah, software engineers, real people who know what they're doing, would laugh at the things I've made, but they work. I'm sure janky, and software engineers would be like, if you publish that, you're going to just be eaten alive by hackers, which is true. They're laughing at it. But how long are they going to be laughing for? I think there's a big divide within people looking at AI between people who are looking at a point in time and saying, it's hallucinating, it can't fully replace software engineers, all that stuff. And people looking at the trajectory. I guess I'm looking at the trajectory and thinking, this is accelerating. It's not slowing down.
For me, I think the huge step upwards was natural language comprehension, being able to go from a verbal prompt to something being done. And that's something that we've seen in Star Trek for a long time. I'm always going to come back to that. But what would the next step be? Would it be a system which can be fully autonomous? Possibly.
Kind of there, aren't we, with these AI agents? People spinning up their open claw bots now and just running them on a separate Mac Mini and just leaving them to do their thing.
Yeah, but I mean, who wouldn't be worried about that? If it's got access to your personal data and it can wipe over files, you're just thinking, oh, this is a nightmare. I don't want to lose control in that way.
But that's why people are buying separate hardware to run it on, presumably not logging into their accounts. I'm not saying it's risk-free, but it's there. And presumably the AI will have its own email account, maybe eventually its own bank account, all that stuff, and you'll just let it go with it. I guess you're still liable for whatever it does. But anyway, we've gone science fiction here. Can I give you a provocative statement to end with, which we can maybe argue about?
Sure.
If you're looking around the world at all the different countries, all the different indices, if you believe that AI is going to eat a lot of software companies' lunch, a lot of professional services firms' lunch, the most exposed index for me is the FTSE 250.
No, I disagree. I think it's the exact opposite. I think the FTSE 250 is the one that's going to win. Because just looking down the list, 50% of it, just under, is financials. Now, that's an industry which will be disrupted, but which is highly regulated. Is there going to be an Anthropic bank? No. Could it be the fact that these companies have a higher margin because they're not spending so much on developers or developing risk systems because that's going to become a lot cheaper? I think that's quite likely.
To me, that's the wrong characterization. Like financials is in there, but it's not really banks. It's things like asset managers, wealth managers, all that stuff where it's professional services effectively, and they're relying on client relationships and being able to charge a really premium fee for a service which I don't think is going to be that defensible. And then you've got recruitment firms, outsourcers like Capita, professional service consultancies. Most of the FTSE 250, which is very exposed to the UK domestic economy, is a middleman index. It's people that sit between the data and the clients and provide a service.
So the question you've got to ask yourself, is that service going to disappear? And is everything going to be brought in-house? And I just don't think that's going to be the case. I think there'll still be service providers, and I think that those will become more efficient as a result of this development. That's not to say there won't be disruption. I think a lot of the companies that don't integrate these things into their systems are going to go to the wall. But I'd argue that, in fact, the UK is actually very well positioned in terms of its economic breakdown because it's got a lot of services industries. And if I had to characterize the UK, I'd say it's the world's office because it does all of the paperwork, the legal services. And I think some of those services are actually likely to become much more efficient if you actually use AI. So are they going to improve their profitability by increasing their margins and reducing their costs by not creating the foundational models, but by using those foundational models effectively?
I love that we found something we so fundamentally disagree on. I completely agree with your characterization of the UK as the world's office, and I love that. I just think the office is the thing that AI is coming for. It's going to be the thing that's automated. It's going to be the white-collar work, and we are in the crosshairs here. And the thing is, it could be a compounding problem as well, because if you look at the FTSE 250, that domestically focused index, the recruitment firms in there sell to the outsourcing companies who process work for the professional services firms, all in this index. And if it does take a wobble, they all kind of go down together because their spending is the revenue of the other companies in the index. It's quite domestically focused. However, on the other hand, I quite like the FTSE 100 as a play because it's got those miners and banks with proprietary data, regulated services, and it's been doing really well, whereas the FTSE 250 is still below where it was in 2021.
Yeah, I think having an overall exposure to the UK economy via the FTSE 350 might be the best choice, because I think what's going to happen is there's going to be rapid change because companies which don't adapt are going to just disappear. They're going to go bust. And companies which do adapt are going to do exceptionally well. But that's always been the case. Whenever we've had a technological change, there's always been a Schumpeterian sweeping away of the old and replacement with a new. So it's simply a question of, can we adapt quickly enough?
Yeah, that's fair. The other market I look at and think might be really vulnerable is the Indian stock market, where, there are some really big IT outsourcing companies there, which again must be in the crosshairs of automation. And the thing that market doesn't have going for it is it looks really expensive when you look at the multiples. At least the FTSE 250 is cheap.
Now, before we go on to the dumb question of the week, let me quickly mention our weekly market roundup. If you want to keep abreast of market, it's really easy. Just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/newsletter to sign up. It's completely free.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. What is a moat? We've mentioned it in passing multiple times in this episode, and it seems to be the thing that is going to determine whether a company can come through the wave of AI disruption and grow its business. But what do we really mean by a moat?
You can probably tell in this episode, we've been struggling to come up with what would be a moat for an existing company that would allow it to stand the onslaught from this disruption that we're seeing right now. And there are certain things which have worked fairly well historically in terms of providing those protections. Now, if you've built up a relationship with a company, and particularly you've built up data with that company, the cost of switching to another company can be very high. It used to be really difficult to switch banks, for example, until legal changes made that more streamlined. And guess what happened? Lots of people switched from expensive service providers to cheaper ones. But if it is the case that switching costs are kept artificially high, either by regulation or by the industry itself, or it's the case that it's just naturally difficult to switch, then I think that does provide a pretty good moat.
Yeah, tech firms have always talked about their ecosystem with a little wink, haven't they? You don't want to leave our platform because then all the stuff you've paid for in recent years goes out of the window.
So Apple is always talking about its ecosystem. So if you've paid for backups on their system, you couldn't use it if you switched to another system. All of the chargers used to be proprietary to Apple.
And also, it's not all negative stuff. I use Apple systems, and they have done a very good job of getting your phone and your computer and your watch and all that stuff to talk to each other with a minimum of effort. If I decided, I want to use a different phone, then I'd be like, it doesn't quite work in the same way with my computer. It's a hassle. So it's a genuine cost to switching. But switching costs aren't the only moat. They're a good one. But another thing that IT services have going for them are network effects. Social media is obviously built on this phenomenon.
So people are still paying to be on X, for example, many politicians, even though some of the aspects of that network are fairly toxic. But it's large. Lots of people are on it, and politicians will just not quit because it's got eyeballs.
And that's a moat because it's really hard to build something really big, isn't it? And the value of social media, for instance, comes from the fact that everyone's on there. But it's not just true of social media. Payment networks, for instance, benefit from the fact that they're widely adopted.
Another one is cost advantages, and their scale is really important. For example, if you want to create a new S&P 500 tracker, good luck, because only the huge companies can now compete in that space. And they've got huge efficiencies due to the economies of scale.
I suppose the big retail chains, this is their main moat as well.
An important discriminator in the past, I think, was things like brand, where, for example, Coca-Cola was almost unassailable in the drinks space. And if you look at the balance sheet of the company, you'll often see that brand is priced in as something which has got an actual monetary value. However, nowadays, I think that's much less important. It's really about what's trending on TikTok, and I think many historical brands would simply be swept aside by that unless they get in front of it.
Yeah, I've always heard that brand power is a moat, but it's maybe the weakest of moats because you can tarnish a brand quite easily and tastes can change. And I know that Warren Buffett, when Berkshire invested in Kraft Heinz, retrospectively, he said he overestimated the value of their brand. They owned a lot of famous brands you'd see on the shelves at supermarkets. And Buffett's bet was, people are always going to buy the exact same shaving foam or mayonnaise or whatever. It seems to have not been true. to the extent he thought it would be.
And then finally, the one we discussed a lot, which is regulatory and legal barriers. So that might be things like patents, which the company holds, which are then enforced. It could be licenses, could be regulatory approvals. And that makes it much more difficult for other companies to enter the space.
And that's the key point, isn't it? It's forward-looking, a moat. It's not about whether the company's doing well now and has a defensible position at the moment. It's how long will that be sustainable into the future? How long can I rely on these cash flows and these margins not being nibbled away at by competition?
So you might be thinking, great, let's go out. We'll just find companies which have one of these really large moats and we'll just pile into them. Easy.
People have tried. Few have succeeded. Although there are ETFs that claim to track moaty companies, aren't there?
There must be a moat ETF.
There is, yeah.
But these companies can always get disrupted, so what seems like a moat today may turn out to be something which is invisible later on, or it turns out not to be relevant at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I always think is identified in hindsight. We go, oh, that company's really successful, they had an amazing moat. But doing it at the time is not so easy, obviously. You might think you could look at a company and go, Apple, Visa, wow, look at their moats. But you probably thought the same thing about BlackBerry. And maybe this is the main criticism of moats, is that it's a narrative exercise.
And if it is a narrative, often people buy into the same narrative because it's the same echo chamber that we all live in. And that means you end up overpaying for the same stocks. And that brings us back to the efficient market hypothesis, which always ruins our day. It's like the rain we've been experiencing for the last 2 months, which is that if there is one of these moats, everybody's going to see it. We see all the same publicly available information and we just pay more for the company. So if you're buying into that story late, then you're not going to benefit.
Yeah, a company might have a genuine massive moat, but if it's trading at 40 times forward earnings, it might not be a better investment than a less moaty company trading at 6 times earnings, right? Valuation always matters.
And we mentioned Nick Train earlier, who's one of the more successful active managers in the UK. Another one would be Terry Smith. And his approach to investing is heavily dependent on this idea of a moat. He wants to buy quality companies, he doesn't want to overpay for them, and then he does nothing once he's bought them. He sticks with them for a long period of time, which sounds like a great idea. And I love his approach. But, and there is a but coming, of course, which is that it is narrative-based. And if you get locked into one of these narratives about why a company's good, you can end up sticking to that company even after the narrative no longer really applies.
I suppose the challenge at the moment is that all the moats we've got used to around software and digital services may disappear really quickly. Usually moats are disrupted slowly, but they might just be obliterated almost overnight.
Yeah, the one thing that moats can't protect you against is an earthquake. That's effectively what one of these technological changes does. What did look like an unassailable position, an unassailable defense, turns out to be like paper.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.